Ah, Gwenpool Media, I am most profoundly obliged. Truly, I scarcely possess the words to convey the magnitude of this honor. To stand, metaphorically of course, before such a distinguished platform and present the culmination of my doctoral research is, I confess, a moment of the utmost personal and academic gratification. My thesis, entitled On the Absolute Supremacy of the Order Pathstrider over the Totality of Memosprite Entities, with the sole and narrow exception of the presiding head of the garden, represents the product of no fewer than 3 to 4 years of rigorous textual exegesis, comparative ontological analysis, and, I dare say, a rather indecent quantity of archival law review. From the very outset of my scholarly journey into the corpus, I never once presumed that I should ascend to this most rarefied summit, the privilege of being invited to Gwenpool Media itself, that most eminent and venerable forum, to divulge my findings before an audience of such evident discernment and intellectual refinement. It is, therefore, with the greatest humility, tempered only slightly by the overwhelming conclusiveness of the evidence, that I submit the central thesis of my work, that an order pathstrider, by virtue of their intrinsic alignment with the governing axioms of structural and metaphysical authority, demonstrably mogs, indeed negdifs, the entire class of Memosprite entities, whose ontological stability and operational sovereignty remain fundamentally subordinate to the hierarchies imposed by order. The sole exception, as my analysis most scrupulously acknowledges, is the head of the garden, whose positional authority introduces a narrow and highly specific countercase that warrants independent treatment. I should like, if I may, to begin by outlining the foundational premises upon which this conclusion rests. I should like to begin with what can only be described as the primordial and utterly non-negotiable premise upon which all subsequent reasoning must necessarily rest, namely, that the path of order does not merely interact with memoria, nor merely influence memoria, but stands as its originating authority, its legislator, and, in the most literal cosmological sense, its progenitor. For we observe in the recorded history of the Asdana star system that its present memoria-saturated condition was not a natural accident, nor the byproduct of spontaneous cosmic drift, but rather the direct consequence of a completed ritual enacted by the twins of order, beings whose authority derived explicitly and exclusively from their alignment with Enna. These twins, though reduced to servitude by the Interastral Peace Corporation and constrained by the architects, nonetheless fulfilled their essential function as instruments of order's cosmogenic mandate through the sacrifice of one on behalf of the other at the very height of a Charmony festival. This act did not merely adjust or influence pre-existing conditions. It constituted a profound restructuring of reality itself, saturating the entire star system with memoria as a direct and unmistakable expression of order's metaphysical authorship. This point is not merely illustrative, it is foundational. For memoria is not merely advantageous to memetic entities, it is their medium, their sustenance, their atmosphere, and their inheritance. One might say, without the slightest exaggeration, that a memosprite without memoria is rather like a fish without water, or perhaps more appropriately, a subject without a sovereign, an entity deprived not merely of comfort, but of the very conditions necessary for continued existence. This reality becomes yet more embarrassingly explicit upon the resurrection of Enna through the agency of Sunday, wherein the re-emergence of the Aeon precipitates a memoria expansion event of staggering magnitude, an ontological detonation, one might reasonably term it. This expansion does not merely propagate, it overwrites, reasserting order's claim over the structure of the universe itself. It is, in every meaningful sense, a second genesis, an act of cosmological authorship that establishes memoria not as an independent or co-equal force, but as a derivative phenomenon whose existence is contingent upon order's legislative authority. Thus, we are forced, however reluctantly some memo-keepers might accept it, to acknowledge a rather awkward truth. Memetic entities exist only because order first established the conditions that allow them to exist at all. Their movement through the cosmos, their persistence across time, their very continuity of self, all are conducted within a framework authored not by remembrance, but by order. And yet, one might contend, creation alone does not necessarily entail continued domination. The artisan does not always control the tool once forged. The architect does not always command the inhabitant of the house. It is here, however, that the historical record delivers its most emphatic rebuttal. In version 3.8, we observe the pathstrider of order, Gopher Wood, confronting the rogue memo keeper Constance the Dahlia, no ordinary entity, but a cremator, an aberrant being whose very nature embodies betrayal and whose existence lies deliberately beyond the regulatory constraints of the garden. And yet, despite her anomalous status, despite her autonomy, despite her intrinsic opposition to constraint itself, she is subjected, unequivocally and irreversibly, to the second divine law. Though you soar like an eagle and make your nest in the stars, I will bring you down from there. This was not rhetoric. It was enforcement. Constance, whose existence is defined by transgression, is rendered bound, not physically alone, but metaphysically, by the authority of order. Her capacity to betray, to evade, to transcend constraint itself, collapses in the presence of order's legislative supremacy. She does not resist successfully. She does not escape. She is subordinated. One observes the same principle, expressed with almost theatrical clarity, in the conduct of Empress Ciridra, whose fusion with the ultimate protocol Talenton resulted in the establishment of a law so absolute that even Evernite, an emanator-level Memosprite of extraordinary scale, found herself constrained by it. Evernite did not lack ambition. She did not lack capability. She lacked jurisdiction. Order had already spoken. And it is here, most intriguingly, that we must turn our attention to the so-called exception, the head of the garden. For the head of the garden is not, as some might naively suppose, a refutation of order's supremacy, but rather its most sincere imitation. As the presiding authority over the Garden of Recollection, she has undertaken measures of unmistakably familiar character: the imposition of capital punishment for betrayal, the systematic pursuit and elimination of rival inheritors, the mobilization of memo keepers under her singular authority, and the monopolization of her path, with the garden as the principal gateway through which the path of remembrance may be entered. These are not the actions of a passive custodian. They are the actions of a sovereign in consolidation. She recognizes, whether explicitly or instinctively, the fundamental truth that order demonstrated in its golden age: that to govern mimetic existence, one must control the conditions under which mimetic existence is possible. Her efforts are not those of a revolutionary inventing a new paradigm, but of a restorationist attempting to reclaim an old one, to establish, within the domain of remembrance, the same absolute jurisdiction that the aeon of order once exercised on the world during the first prosperity, that Sunday temporarily birthed with the aid of the harmonic string Dominicus in, and that which the first and only imperator of Amphorius had via the ultimate protocol. In other words, even the apparent exception proves the rule. For the head of the garden does not transcend order's model. She replicates it, and so the conclusion presents itself with the quiet dignity of inevitability. Memosprites may traverse the stars. They may accumulate knowledge. They may, on occasion, imagine themselves independent actors in the cosmic drama. But they do so within a stage constructed by order, upon a medium created by order, and under laws that order has demonstrated time and again its capacity to enforce. Order pathstriders, therefore, do not even contend with mimetic entities as rivals. They stand, as they always have, in the position of absolute authority over them.